Hello, hello, folks. Come on into the webinar. We're excited to have you here. Go ahead and as we are just letting folks have a moment or two to come on in, go ahead and come on in, put your feet up. For some of you, it's a little after lunchtime. For some of you, you're still on morning coffee. We're going to let everybody kind of get in the webinar, and then we're going to start in just a moment. If you would like to, you can introduce yourself in the chat, where you're broadcasting from or calling in from. We'd love to see who's excited about Redress today. So come on in, come on in. We'll start in just a minute. All right. Well, let me just say it's a little bit after the 2 o'clock hour, so we want to get started there. We have so much to share. I am so excited to be joined by this incredible group of panelists here who will be talking about redress and the organizing that's happening all across the country to build a movement. So if you are here for any other reason than to talk about racial segregation, redress, and how we get to a better place than the one we're in right now, then this is not your space. My name is Dr. Tiffany Manuel, and I serve as the interim director of the Redress Movement, and I have the pleasure of serving in that capacity with a number of colleagues who are dedicated, passionate, and committed to how we address the issue of racial segregation in our country today. We are organizing a movement across this here country to change what we see is happening in our nation today. That's based on a foundation that has been racist, that is very core, that has been at best unfair to a large number of people and communities across this country, and at its worst has really undermined the opportunities for people across this country to live into their best and most powerful selves. Despite that, there are a number of folks, probably many of you on the call today, who are dedicated to getting us to a better place. And I'm so fortunate today to have the opportunity, one, to be leading the organization that's doing some of this work, and also to be connected to the powerful folks that you're going to hear talk today. If with Simone, you're going to hear us talk to Tanika Johnson, you're going to hear us talk to John Comer about some of these issues. I did want to say just at the top of the call that unfortunately Tracy Stewart came under the weather, is under the weather today and unable to join us, but I will do my very best to represent the voice of some of our funders. She's from the Colorado Health Foundation. I'll do my best to represent some of the many funders who have looked at our work, at our mission, our organization, and our vision and said, not only do we think this is something that's worthy of attention, but it's worth our dollars and investment. So let me just get started. I'm going to try to make this brief. I want to just say just 1 minute, maybe not even 2 minutes, 1 minute on just what the Redress Movement is. If you haven't already had a chance to go to our website, then you should, the redressmovement.org. I want to say that we are a Black-led but multiracial movement to bring redress around the issues of housing segregation in our country today. We have 4, I would say, key principles that are part of our approach. The first part of that is to educate people about how we got to this place, and we are grounded by the incredible scholarship of Richard Rothstein, who many of you know wrote the book The Color of Law, and many other scholars across the country who have been doing research to have us really understand how we got here, not just the general sense, but specifics with evidence and data and all the things that come with real top-notch empirical research. I like to say, at some point for many of us who've been talking about this issue for a long time, we didn't always have the research to support what we knew was happening in our communities. But because of the scholarship of these folks, we now have receipts. We have receipts, right, about how institutions collaborated, participated in the undermining of many parts of our communities. And so our movement to educate folks about what that history looks like is the first part of our platform. The second part, of which we're going to talk about all today, is to organize folks all across the country to do something about that history, right? It's not enough to know the history. If you don't do anything about it, then what's the point, right? So we're going to organize people around that history. And we have many folks on our call today who talk about how they're organizing folks in their space, whether it's from the vantage point of architecture with my good friend April Simone, or whether it's from the vantage point of the redress movement, or what, as you hear Tanika Johnson talk about, organizing from the vantage point of art, right, in our communities. Then our third part of our platform is about how we win, right? How we win initially some small victories, right, for communities across the country. We recognize that organizing is like a muscle. You got to start with some of those victories, sometimes that are small. And the last part of that is to amplify those wins so we get bigger wins. So we want to maybe start small with some of those smaller wins, but get stronger as a movement across this country to do what we know is possible. So for this webinar today, we have 4 panelists that are joining us. Actually 3, I'm sorry. I keep thinking that Tracy's going to join, but she's under the weather. We have 4 panelists today who are joining us, and I'd love to have them come on screen, if y'all could come on screen, and I'm going to start to introduce you all. And we can go ahead and take the PowerPoint down. So welcome. Come on screen, love the people. I'm gonna just take a moment to just do sort of, I call it my introduction. And the reason I say that, because there's the formal introduction, right? Which is like, April Simone, Tanika Johnson. I'm gonna do the introduction that is about how I came to know this incredible group of folks. So I'm gonna start with April. So I met April when she was working with some folks I was working with at the time, working on something called Redress, the red line. Wait, what was it called? Wait, Redesign the Red Line in many different cities across the country. And what I was so impressed by was the aha moments that people were having when they would come to the installations of these events, and they would get a chance to see on the walls, all across the walls, like the history of what had happened in their communities, but visually through art, through charts, through graphs, through pictures and quotes, so they could really see it. And it's so interesting because it brought to those conversations people who would never like pick up a book and read about it, who would never have been, otherwise educated about the stuff, but they came to the exhibit and were like mesmerized, like staring at walls for hours, like, wait a minute. And the aha moment was so fantastic. So I could say many things about my good friend April, but I would say she's the person who brings the intersectionality between architecture, planning, systems thinking, all in one cabal, from New York, from the Bronx. So folks will recognize that in her voice and her tone and all that good stuff, but just doing incredible work. And I would say, bringing that work to a set of disciplines that don't always think about their work in this way, particularly architecture. So in a minute, I'm going to turn over to you, April, and talk a little bit about that work. I want to also introduce just very generally our panelist, Tanika Johnson. And I will say that I first became aware of Tanika's work through Richard Rothstein. Many of you know Richard and his daughter have been in the deep throes of writing a book that is set to come out middle of this year. So for those of you who were Color of Law fans, who read that book and were mesmerized by that and said, you want more of that? It is coming this summer. But in the process of writing that book, there were chapters, and I read early versions about Tanika and her work in the Folded Map Project. And Richard said, you got to talk with Tanika. She's doing fantastic work. And so when I started to look at her work, I'm like, oh, okay. And so you're going to hear her talk in just a second about her fantastic work. She is a photographer by training, but a social justice artist, lifelong resident Southside Chicago, the neighborhood of Inglewood. She is the co-founder, there she goes, co-founder of Inglewood Arts Collaborative and the Resident Association of Greater Inglewood, which is trying to reframe the whole narrative of the South Side and how the South Side came to be the way it came to be, which I love that. In addition to that, she's just got so many awards and folks who just appreciate her work that it's just, I can't even name it all. But I want to name one. Just I think last year, 2021, she was named the National Public Housing Museum's Art as Instigator. Okay, first of all, let's just stop it. Art as Instigator, I love that. where she is really talking about this new project called Inequality for Sale, which highlights like the living history of the homes in Greater Englewood that were sold on land contract in the 50s and 60s, and literally were stolen underneath people. So I'm looking forward to hear all about that, and I'm sure y'all are too. Welcome, Tanika. And last but not least, our very own at the Redress Movement, John Comer. You know, at first, John came to our attention. We were looking for a person who could lead some of our field organizing nationally across the country. And I remember my first conversation with John, and I was like, this brother, this brother's deep. Listen. And I was thinking about that because he was talking about the relationship between housing and voting rights and things like what's happening to folks who are formerly incarcerated and trying to find homes and what that looks like and how we think differently about that. He was talking about sexual harassment of housing residents and how his work on organizing housing residents to push back against sexual harassment from maintenance staff at some of these housing projects and things like that was really important. And I really hadn't heard folks talk about that particular part of organizing people in the housing space. So I was like, okay, well, listen, you're about to have a good time with the Redress Movement because we're about to do this thing. So John on the Redress Movement has been leading our field team in a couple different cities, and Charlotte and Milwaukee, and also in Denver. And we are expanding those cities to have more boots on the ground across the country. So listen, folks, if y'all have come for a conversation today about folks who are doing this work on the ground, you have come to the right place, and we're about to get into this. So welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So I want to start really talking about what made you say yes to Redress. And in fact, our digital team at the Redress Movement, led by Rhea Thompson-Washington, has a campaign around say yes to Redress, where we're trying to get people all across the country, average everyday folks who are going to say, yes, I need to be involved in this. And in fact, we have something on our website around say yes to Redress. But I would love to hear from you all before we get into the specifics of what y'all do and how you got here, and not how, but the specifics of what your projects are, what you're working on. Say a little bit about you personally and sort of what made you say yes to this kind of movement, the Redress Movement. Like, what did you, not to our organization necessarily, but just to the movement around what it means to go back and redress. I don't know who wants to start first. Come on, come on. What made you say yes to Redress? Who's first? Now y'all get Sean. Okay, Tanika, go ahead, work it out.
Well, I guess the best way to kind of explain why I felt it was important for me to learn more, be involved more, and actually be a part of a redress movement is by sharing with you all a little bit about my work. And I'm going to share my screen just so you all can understand why I would even need to show a video of my work. It's easier to understand by watching other than hearing me talk through it. But I'm going to share with you media coverage of my project that Tiffany referred to, that Mr. Rothstein was introduced to me through, and it's called Folded Map. And it really just explores visualizing segregation in Chicago and how that's with us today. So I'm going to share my screen and kind of lead with that because in the media coverage, it includes my why. Share sound, excuse me, you all. Oh, I'm not able to share the sound. Let's just see if it works. Hold on. Let me know if you all can hear. Yes, no?
Yeah, we got it. It's low, but we can hear it. Yep.
Oh, let me see if I can turn it up.
A new approach to bridging divides in Chicago. Neighborhoods from the city's north and south sides are banding together to take on some very deeply rooted issues. The differences between these communities, they are stark. But as Adriana Diaz shows us, together they are tackling segregation and the inequity that comes with it.
Do you have any of those posters left?
Yeah, I know. Chicago residents Nanette Tucker and Wade Wilson share a love of gardening and craft beer. That would be kind of cool.
That would be cool.
They're like neighbors, sort of. Wade is called your map twin. Why are you guys twins? We're twins because when you follow the map, we touch one another on the map, north and south. Like many cities, Chicago is a grid with many streets spanning north to south. If you fold a map of the city in half, you can match addresses on the north side with the same block on the south side. You lived all your life never thinking you had a twin. And now
I have one.
yeah. They live about 15 miles apart, but Wilson and his wife Jennifer live in the majority white north side neighborhood of Edgewater, while Tucker is in the mostly black south side neighborhood of Englewood. How would you explain the differences between both of your neighborhoods, which are essentially equidistant from the center, but worlds apart in many ways?
It's very clear that neighborhoods primarily on the north side have had more investment. Everything from the street lighting to grocery stores, restaurants, it's plentiful on the north side and it's not here.
It's almost like you feel a light come on at a certain spot when you're going north. And when you're coming back south, you can feel the glow that's upon us in Englewood. Curiosity. They met through Tonika Lewis Johnson, a social justice artist who grew up in Englewood, a community often in the news.
Two mass shootings.
Shot in the head this
afternoon. Shooting claims the life of a 15-year-old boy in West Englewood.
Lewis Johnson created the Folded Map Project, which includes this film, to change the conversation. She contrasts how the same street, like Ashland Avenue,
They look very different.
looks on the north side
The sidewalks,
and the south side.
the maintenance of the building, none of which have anything to do with gun violence. Only disinvestment.
Chicago's segregation is due in part to racist policies like redlining, where banks would designate properties in minority areas delineated in red as too risky for mortgage lending, excluding Black Americans from a primary pathway of building wealth, homeownership.
You have neighborhoods that are predominantly Black that have low home ownership as a result of the discriminatory practices. Businesses left, so you don't have a business corridor, so therefore you don't have jobs. And now the schools are starting to fail because they aren't properly funded.
Her solution, bring the North and the South together with map twins. It can feel so overwhelming to try to take on systemic racism, but you have found a way to almost chip away at it one person at a time, one pair at a time.
Yes, let's use segregation as the actual thing that can connect us.
In her project, she doesn't shy away from uncomfortable truths.
How much was it home?
It was $61,000.
And how much was your home?
$535,000.
You ask Wade and Nanette what they each paid for their house. You know, it felt a little awkward.
I think the awkwardness helps people understand how we're all participating in this system that was created before us. And it doesn't truly reflect how we want to connect with each other today.
Frankly, we're privileged. And it's hard to sit next to a friend who hasn't enjoyed that privilege. We realize that there's an opportunity to actually do something.
Wilson and Tucker are doing something together. 3 years after they met through the Folded Map Project, with others, they created Englewood Renaissance, which is helping beautify parts of Englewood and is now focusing on increasing homeownership here. Creating a community together. The economics might be different. The neighborhoods might be different, but the core of who I am is pretty much the same as Wade and Jennifer. I want the same things they want. For CBS This Morning, Adriana Diaz, Chicago.
This is such an important story.
Yeah.
Such an important story. You have this.
Excuse me, trying to find you all. So that is my project, Folded Map, and really at the core, my involvement with desiring, wanting, and advocating for a redress movement is literally because I grew up in a neighborhood that was deeply impacted by it, and trying to understand its history and how all of those systemic issues impacted my life and everyone around me is what led me to ultimately being involved in this work and using my art as a platform to amplify these issues and educate the larger public, because sometimes art may be an easier way for some to access and understand these large systemic issues.
I think that's exactly right. That is amazing. And there's so many things I love about that. We're going to get into that in our conversations. But one of the things I want to just say is just the commonality of folks. Like at the core of who we all are is really the same thing. We all want the same things. We all want to have a bright future. We want to have our kids grow up in a great place. We want to have, be able to, have neighborhoods that are thriving and to have our lives reflect what's happening, right, in our communities that are thriving. So bringing folks together under the sort of common and shared values is so powerful, especially in a world today when we're often pitted against each other, right? Folks are pitting communities against each other, not trying to bring them together. I want to say one more thing about that, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, John, in just a second. One of the things I also wanted that I peeled out of there was just the importance of building kind of a multiracial opportunity for folks to come together, because so often when people of color talk about racism, we get, right, that's their issue. Like, y'all go over there and talk about that because that's about y'all. But what I love about what you've done, Tanika, is to say, no, this is about us. This is a multiracial conversation. This is a multiracial movement. It won't work if only the people of color are saying, hey, hello, right? This is not fair. It's got to be all of us together recognizing how we've been brought, as you said in the video, in a system that we didn't create, but now we're living into, and we have to change that. So I wanted to share, part of what we're doing at the Redress Movement is we're a Black-led organization, but we are multiracial in our organizing. It is very important for us to make sure that people, no matter where they come from, where their background, where they start from, get in here, because we won't solve it any other way. So I want to just turn it over to my colleague, John, to talk about the organizing that we're doing across the country, right? And first start a little bit about why you said yes to Redress, right? It's certainly what we're doing. Why of all the things you could be doing right now as an organizer, and there's so many social issues you could be organizing for, about, within, what made you say, you know what, this Redress, I'm going after that. Have at it.
So, it's a pleasure to be here. Tanika, awesome work. Good seeing you again. Glad to be on the panel with April as well. Thank you, Dr. T. So, honestly, growing up as a young Black male, like a lot of other Black folks, you experience bias that comes in a way that systemically tries to suffocate you. And anyone who is experiencing any type of trouble to breathe will fight to get that air. And that's naturally what happened with me. It's not necessarily that I grew up wanting to be any type of organizer or activist. I actually was very much into science and wanted to be a scientist. But once I got to the point where I experienced my first case of police harassment, which I was 10 years old, walking through my neighborhood, which was all Black, in Southeast Raleigh, I began to be able to relate to some of the things that I was hearing that was kind of being pushed to the side in the news. And at that point in time, one of those things was the actual one, some of the lyrics that came from NWA, and people were kind of putting them off as being very violent. But what I realized was I had something in common with these teenage Black men or young Black males from Compton, California. And I experienced the same thing, just kind of walking through my neighborhood where, I was completely harassed by a police officer. Those things never stopped as I began to get older. But I ended up, I have a fighter spirit, that comes from my mother. And I'm a thinker, which very much, a lot of it comes from my father. And so I had a household that kind of, had put me together in a way that I just realized, I have to fight this. And I ended up going to a HBCU, North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina. We just won the Celebration Bowl, so let me put that out there. So I'm happy for us. But you know, the reason for HBCUs came from systemic oppression and segregation, right? Like, so the fact that I end up in a larger extended educational community to learn from a community to teach me more about our history and our abilities and opportunities to get there, it was just a lot of it kind of woke me up in a way that I wasn't awakened. And Durham was one of the original Black Wall Streets. And the founder of North Carolina Central was like at the foundation of a lot of that. And so like that just instilled a lot of pride in me to begin to start organizing in the neighborhoods right around the school. And that just came from something that I saw that I needed to do. And from there, once I saw that I could actually make a difference, and I learned that there was organizations that were out here doing that kind of work, I caught on, and, I ended up going to New York and organizing there, and a bit in Chicago, and I got sent around. But most importantly, I saw wins. I saw us winning, experienced us winning, being a part of wins. And that's why I'm 21 years deep now into this. So, and we're here at the Redress Movement, an organization that hasn't officially even been together for 10 months. And here we are on the ground in Milwaukee, in Denver, and Charlotte. We started from scratch, but we've attracted some of the most beautiful people on the ground to fight and to identify what they want to fight to move forward. So Dr. T, I don't know how much you want me to go into that before I stop, but I can keep going. Let me know.
Yeah, say a little bit more about a little bit about each city, about what you're seeing in each one of those cities. It'd be helpful.
So just recently we held a press conference in Milwaukee. What we've identified and the groups have identified and the organizer Dynasty Caesar has identified in Milwaukee is a need and an overlooking of the Board of County Supervisors not having a housing subcommittee on, or any kind of housing committee to discuss and actually vote on and pull resources towards fixing some of the issues in Milwaukee. So one of the smaller things we were able to do was, and it's really larger than what it sounds like, because it's hard to get 30 some people to agree on one letter, right? Like that we're about to send to the Board of County Supervisors. So Dynasty did a great job in pulling that together, and then we delivered that to the Board of County Supervisors, and it's beginning to get legs. We had some supervisors to show up to the press conference, and now we have some supervisors showing up to our roundtable that meets regularly. And it's a bunch of different groups. It's a multi-cultural group with groups from the suburbs as well as the city. But what we're actually looking more towards doing is things around neighborhood stabilization. Many Black communities not receiving the resources that they needed to receive, or other neighborhoods have received throughout the city. And gentrification is threatening a lot of those folks, and they don't want to move, and they shouldn't have to move. So around those type of campaigns, that's what we're moving into. In Denver, we have some rogue HOAs, homeowner associations. Naturally, we began to go into this work because we learned that a lot of the homeowner associations in the neighborhoods that we're working in have the power to foreclose on people's homes. They have the power to levy fines. And so they levy a bunch of bogus fines at times, and they compound very quickly to where people can't pay them. Next thing you know, that HOA can foreclose on that home. And so we found out that much of what was happening, this was happening to Black families. And it had been happening in this particular neighborhood, Green Valley Ranch, for 20 years prior to our arrival there. And so it's a lot of great work being led by Kevin Patterson, who's our organizer in Denver. And this legislative session, there is a bill to help to address some of these ills in the state legislature. So we'll be working on that. But we'll also kind of be looking more into a rental affordable housing campaign as well. And then we have Charlotte, and that's led by our organizer Jasmine in Charlotte, and Jasmine Wright. And so Charlotte's one of the fastest growing cities in the country. Because it's one of the fastest growing cities in the country, the affordable housing ain't growing fast enough. All right. And so we are organizing people to be able to fight back and keep up, because as the cost of living skyrockets in Charlotte and across North Carolina, there has to be a voice, there has to be organized groups that are willing to address that before we have another issue of housing, which is homelessness. And we don't want to get to that point of homelessness. You know, we want to be able to redress in certain ways. There's a community named Brooklyn in Charlotte. They call it Uptown Charlotte, but anyone who's not familiar with Charlotte is really downtown Charlotte. And so that neighborhood was bulldozed, you know, with really not much left for the families. Those families dispersed throughout the city. And then some of those families ended up in the neighborhood where a highway was built through it later. So there's an entire lineage of displacement that goes on with housing in all the areas that we're in that we can trace. And so, you know, that's the 3 cities that we're on the ground with. Of course, we have a wonderful team, research team, digital team that are all over the place. But, you know, that's pretty much what I have to say about our 3 cities, and I'll stop there.
Love it. And I love folks in the chat from Charlotte saying, yeah, that whole thing of how they renamed, right? The Charlotte, that was all PR like that. That's not what people who live in Charlotte, like, you know, had in mind. And I think we see that like across the country, like the creative license that folks take when they want to recreate neighborhoods under the auspices of trying to improve the neighborhood under urban renewal and all these titles. But the impact of a lot of that is exactly what you were talking about, John. The impact of that is a lot of communities, right, end up a lot of folks being displaced, moved out of homes, or the value of their homes undermined, or all kinds of things that make it even harder for those folks who've already faced a lot of discrimination in other areas of their lives. You talked about it in terms of criminal justice system, but have already faced some of these other issues, now having to face that in terms of not either being homeless or not having a home, or being pushed into neighborhoods that are clearly like not lifting up the best part of who they are, their human potential and our human potential as a nation. So more to come on what's happening in terms of organizing. I'm sure many people are putting their questions in the chat and have lots to say about that. Last but not least, I'd love to bring April into this. So of all the things, you are so talented on so many levels. Why say yes to redress? Of all the things you could be, especially as an architect, right? You could be building skyscrapers, and you probably are doing some of that too, but building skyscrapers and fancy condos and all this kind of stuff. And as long as I've known you, you have always been really super dedicated, right, to thinking about what is best about how we not only revitalize neighborhoods and communities, but how we fix what got broken in the first place. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your journey and how you say yes to redress. Take it away.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Tanika. Thank you, John. It's great to be part, again, of this growing conversation across the country. This work, you know, when we say why or how we start, it's in my DNA. You know, born and bred, as you said, in the Bronx, and learning very, very early on. I'm trying to share my pics here, so I'm not sure if you guys can see my screen. Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it. We're good. We can see it.
Great.
You're good.
Just, you know, again, trying to understand from very beginning how we arrive at situations where people like my mom come up and look at neighborhoods that, again, are intact, have full ecologies, in this concept of buying into the Americana. And, you know, you see the inset picture of what it looked like in the 1930s. And this is the house I grew up in, because very shortly after she moves in, we see what John mentions, urban renewal, because 30 years unbeknownst to her prior, decisions were made around which neighborhoods we're going to consider to be valuable and worthy of investments and which weren't. So I think very early on, tasting this concept of 3 rooms in a burnt out home with no running hot water and a kerosene heater instills a humility within you to say, this comes from legacies of dehumanization, where we reinforce these concepts of human hierarchy within the built environment. As you know, I launched the Undesign the Red Line exhibition in 2015 to really begin to congregate people from all walks of life into a space that really unpacks more than what the nuance looking at a map can tell you about the intricacies within our community. As you mentioned, we need pedagogy. So a lot of the work is centered around this concept of pedagogy and how do we change it. When we look at, again, this normalization, these neighborhoods that on the screen were my backyard, and we think that this concept of a psychology is what is normal. And again, this isn't something that froze in time in the 70s and 80s, but is very much, if you travel down to Baltimore, you go to places in Trenton where I do work, or even portions of New Orleans, every space in this country is still experiencing some form of spatial dehumanization. So this work, again, centers around this concept of how do we talk about this, particularly in professional spaces like architecture and planning, where the psychology, even if people know about a redlining map, the prescriptions of how we address or redress these conditions really still form a patriarchal lens of I know better than you and I can do better than you. And when we see the designs that come into our community, they're very much still very similar of giving hierarchy of value. We use vernacular like low income, middle income, and all of this really still fosters and cultivates the divides in our community. So again, not only is this in my DNA, but it plays out in the various cities that I go to, because these are very, very real stories. And it is about the healing aspect of what Tanika is mentioning and raising in her work. How do you bring people together, particularly the people who are being put in positions of power to steward the ideologies and principles of our democracy? That life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not just rhetorical gestures and nods, but they have to be part of a practice. And in order to cultivate that practice, we have to undo the legacies that have really conditioned cognitively within all of us, that there's those who deserve value and those who don't. And even in the best of intentions, we still see this facet come in to how we design our cities and our communities. We still label buildings luxurious. We still, again, label this as a low-income community. And that carries weight. If we are really truly wanting to redress, we have to begin with the spatial psychology of how we even describe our areas. So I don't know how far you want me to go, but the inspiration again comes from this and incidents of what even has happened in more recently. That's very close to home. In Paterson, New Jersey, my newly turned 19-year-old cousin was just shot in the head. And again, this is not just violence. This is generational trauma that we then absorb because it's in our DNA to say, what's going to happen next? When does the bottom fall out? And when it conjures this rage of that, these are intentionally planned ways of either erasure through what John, you mentioned with gentrification and displacement, to then the value aspect, that you just let communities devolve to the point of just what we are seeing across the country from food apartheid and beyond. So a lot of the work I center it on 3 pillars: is pedagogy, process, and spatial practice. Back to your point, Tiffany, how do we learn different? And not just learn different, how does that understanding invoke new processes, whether it is within the architectural community, whether it is in the planning community, whether it's in the even community engagement and organizing community? What are we organizing around? And John mentioned some pieces of legislation. Yes, we need more, because as our awareness awakens, which is exciting, we still don't have in place the instruments that are going to be necessary to address the systemic and structural conditions and challenges of our communities and our environments, with the ultimate goal of, again, creating more healing, just and inclusive environments. So I'm going to stop there before we get into the projects, but this is a very pivotal moment in particularly our nation's history and the forward trajectory of our collective democracy. And if each of us don't identify ways that we can put into practice these principles and democratic values, then again, what is the consciousness we will have for future generations to say, this is not right, or this is not what democracy represents? Thank you.
I love that. Fantastic. Fantastic. I'm steeped in this all the time, every day. And I have found that I've learned something from each of you, even in just this conversation we've had so far. That was fantastic, April. And I want to just pull out something that you said that really struck me. A number of things. It's not something that I think many of us, as think about all the time, but certainly for those of us who are organizing, have to think about, and that is, as you call it, just the consciousness of the people that we're talking to, whether those are the consciousness of the folks who have endured generational trauma. This is not just what happened yesterday or in the 50s and 60s. Generations of, right, not just disinvestment, but violence, right, is what we have been dealing with. And so when you're trying to organize folks in a place where many of them have experienced generational trauma, that takes a special skill set. I'm gonna ask all each about that in just a second. But also on the other side of it, I think a lot about, especially in the work that I do at the Case Made, is also about how do you bring people forward into these conversations who don't want to be in these conversations, who may not have experienced the same kind of generational trauma, right? They got the benefit of being on the other side of that dividing line, right? So if I think about the Folded Map Project, Tanika, the folks who are on the other side of this, who really could say, you know what, I don't want to have anything to do with that. It's not my problem. I didn't make this. They could have said that. But what does it take to get those folks, the folks who have all the power and privilege, who don't have to lean in that and may not want to, but what's the psychology or the way that we pull those folks forward? I think about that every day in the work I do on case making, because that is a part of the work that we have to do. But I'd love to have some conversation about that. On the one hand, the folks have experienced the kind of generational trauma, which makes it hard for us to organize in some respects, because people are dealing with a lot of stuff even today. And then the folks who may not have experienced generational trauma in that way, but they've got to be part of this conversation, right? Speak to that. I don't care who starts first. Have at it.
Yeah, I'll kick it off. Through my engagement with diverse groups of people, through my Folded Map project, and also my training as a journalist, the one thing that you get taught in journalism school is the singular story and how to show people to care about an issue, a story. You have to help them understand how it relates to them. And so that training as a journalist was easy for me to apply in the work that I do now, because when I'm talking to groups of people who, are on the receiving end of the privilege and may not understand completely how the impact of these systemic issues affect them, I've learned that you have to show them the ways in which they are also impacted, even though it might not be to the, inconvenience, negative, detrimental aspect as Black and Brown communities. But just an example, when I talk about Folded Map to predominantly white groups, and, there are obviously individuals who care, who want to make change, they don't understand the ways in which they have been impacted socially and how segregation has completely constructed their homogenous social network. And because of that, they're not able to have these connections, these relationships with people who they, otherwise might have strong bonds with. And I really drive home the point just on a general level without even getting into the actual aspects of housing and all of those things, just relationship wise, that at the base level, segregation and all of these inequities have actually closed you off from a way of understanding and empathy and relationships that will expand your human experience and just your connectivity to the rest of the world. When I give them the example of the non-Black people that I have strong friendships with that were made in my high school years from going to a diverse school, and that we're still friends today. And I tell them that my white friend, Steve, who's a Polish guy from Chicago, he can tell you himself that his friendships with non-white people in Chicago expanded his understanding in ways that contributed to him thinking different from the rest of his family. It influenced the career path that he chose. It influenced who he even married, because his depth of human empathy and understanding was deepened. And so, you know, trying to get them to understand that they're missing out on something. And that something for me is usually the relational aspect, because that's something that they can see. You know, they might not understand, oh, why my social network is all white, or, you know, but I really just use that aspect as an entry point into helping them understand how we're all impacted in ways that we don't even think about sometimes. So that's my entry point into trying to get people on the other side to understand this work and how it doesn't just only impact those negatively influenced, but that we're all negatively impacted by this to varying degrees, but we're all impacted. And specifically in Chicago, you know, just the decreased options of where we can live, the fact that our tax dollars go to public safety, those are all actual ways that we're all, you know, impacted by it. But instead of getting into all of that, I just start with the relational.
I think that's right. And you just hit on a number of things, right? So some of you know, a lot of the part of the work that I do is part of my thinking thing is always about how we make a stronger case for getting people to fight for justice, no matter who they are. And what you just talked about really reinforce sort of two principles that we know for sure. One is this notion of, right, connecting to people's aspirations for something better, right? That commonality and helping people see their aspirations in front of you, right? And really, you talked about that is like, how does it apply to you? Because every part of your life, right, benefits from the relationship that you get, right, when you're connected to not just this part of Chicago or your community, but this part of Chicago, your network of people, of creativity, of opportunity, of diversity, of just experiences just exploded, right? Because you've opened yourself up in a way that you might not have. And that is key to getting people inside of our movement. The second principle that you really talked about was what we call the sort of, you know, the loss aversion. The when people think they're losing something, they're more likely to come forward because nobody likes to lose. Nobody wants to, even if it's something they didn't particularly want, if it's mine, I don't want to lose it. And so when you tell people that, like, there's a loss you're experiencing, like, you're losing too. You may look at that, you know, the community across the way and say, well, it's their problem, but you actually lost a whole lot. And let me tell you what you just lost, right? Because your social network and the world that you live in looks like this and not this. People respond to that. There's a human psychology, right? Able to come back to what you were talking about, a human psychology, a cognition about, well, wait a minute, I'm gonna lose that. Well, what do I have to do about it? And a part of what we're doing at the Redress Movement is saying, yeah, what do you want to do about it? Show up for us. Show up at the press briefing. Show up in the community meeting. Show up in the local committee. Show up for your neighbors. People, you know, show up, right? And we're starting to get folks to be able to do that. Let me hear from April and John. This is this question about how we pull people forward, this sort of, you know, thinking about generational trauma and how you pull people forward who are challenged there, and also pulling folks who may not be, you know, challenged in that way, but have a different set of constraints and things. I'd love to hear from your perspective too about that.
So, you know, I think it's very important to keep in mind that, you know, if you're a person who wants to take action, in order to be effective, sometimes, you know, we have to move strategically. So you have to meet people where they are. And a lot of times that's not pretty, it's not fun, but like keeping our eyes on the prize, for lack of better words, but the goals that we're trying to get to can keep us refreshed and being involved in any movement. So really listening, but also understanding that, you know, listening with a purpose to understand whether this person processes information more on a qualitative side or a quantitative side. Because I can speak to you about history and what happened to me the entire time, but we also must remember that some of the greatest crimes have been covered up. So there's a lot of brainwashing that has been done to make people think that you know, or you just ended up there because you guys didn't, you know, you were lazy, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. And so you know, one of the helpful things that we've used, of course, one of the books is The Color of Law, and The Color of Law has pulled certain numbers and enlightened certain people who have been hearing, you know, for a long time that this is wrong, this is how this has happened, but some people need numbers. And sometimes as a person or organizer, you know, that can be a bit disheartening because it feels inhumane that you have to actually learn of some numbers, some statistics to come join the fight. But hey, that's what it takes for some people. And then there's a qualitative side that comes on the other end of that, right? Like, so some people begin with qualitative, some people begin with quantitative, but like at the end of the day, both are very necessary to have. And then we have to understand that we're very different people coming together for a movement. And a lot of times we, you know, the word movement is thrown around in a way that it really shouldn't be. It should deserve a lot more respect. And really movement, what that says to me is that it demands a lot of details. It's a lot of details that goes into creating a movement. And you can create a movement, but can you sustain a movement? And that's one of the greatest things. Can we continue to grow? Not just by numbers, but can we continue to grow in our understanding? So just because I was able to recruit you with quantitative data does not mean we're ready to sit in the room with different cultures, because that is what a lot of people will hold high. It's a sense of respect. It's a don't disrespect my culture, don't disrespect my family, and where we come from. And so there's a lot of cultural, holistic education that has to go on as well. But that has to be done also in a timely manner. And it's hard to balance because, you know, day by day, people are losing their homes. So like there's a balance we have to strike between pretty much getting to a certain level of liberation, but also being efficient in doing it. And what does that look like? And also just discussing that with the group of people. Like, what does this look like? Laying down the ground rules with that group of people, allowing them all the input into that process so it can really be genuinely from the grassroots of the people, but also within this aspect of what we're fighting for, ensuring that is Black led in some kind of form or fashion, and discussing what that looks like, discussing what allyship looks like covering all of those bases as much as we can. And then, but also having a commitment to people to understand that along the way, we're not always going to get it right. And when we get it wrong, this is what the process might look like for us to come back and continue moving as one.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I love that. And I want to highlight a couple of things. One, just to reinforce what you just said, we had John's team held a really small, I would say, national convening just this past Saturday, bringing people together from the 3 cities in Charlotte, Milwaukee, and Denver. And one of the most powerful, I think, parts of that convening is very short, but just an opportunity to kind of informally bring people together just to talk about what we're doing for the year and get our heads straight about where we're going with the movement. And one of the most powerful moments in that segment was a woman from, I think she's from Milwaukee, and she was talking about the HOA. Correct me if I'm wrong, John, but where she was from. But she was talking about how the HOA had fined her for these small things over a period of time. Then the fines got larger and larger, like thousands, like $8,000. And then Kevin says in Denver, thank you, Kevin. In Denver, and fined her, and then took her house. And just, you know, and I was thinking of in that moment, there are two sides of that. And I think is what you were talking about, John. There's the head and the heart. Right, the head says, let me figure out what happened in that situation so we can write that so that never happens again to anybody else in Denver or anywhere else, right? That the house that you have saved for, you know, put your pictures up and you're, you know, started to raise your kids in, gets taken from you for something that you couldn't avoid, right? In a situation that was clearly unfair. Let's make sure we never have that happen again. So let's understand that. But I was also thinking about the emotionalism of that. Like, this woman has lost, right, the very thing that she worked I mean, this was not a rich woman, but worked her life, put her life savings into. And the emotional part of that, the generational part of that, that's like, right, having to start over all again after having that experience and being willing to fight, right, in the context of a redress movement, in the context of what she's already experienced. That head and heart thing, boy, it's hard. We have to get that together. There's a part of this that is about, you know, pulling people forward because you understand what they've been through and understanding why we have to be sensitive to that. And then there's a head, which means we got to get our data together, John, to your point. We got to get our research and facts together. That's why at the Redress Movement, our first foundational thing that we do with communities is, what does the research say? Our research team, led by Bo and Reggie and Malik, are on the call today. It's so central. You see on our website, our story maps. For that reason, you got to have receipts, people. You can't be out here just saying what you think, right? All of that emotion is great, but we've been crying about this for a long time. If you're crying and you ain't got data, it's a problem out here, right? So trying to figure out that really interesting, you know, right, intersection between the head and the heart, the quantitative and the qualitative, to use your point, John, between those two parts of the brain to make a strong case for why this is super important. Oh, Lord, it ain't easy. It ain't easy, folks, right? But this thing, we'll be the first to tell you, even in the redress movement, it's rough out here in these streets. I mean, like, and I mean that with all sincerity, that, you know, this is a great experiment for us too, trying to figure out the right way to do it. And we are probably, as you say, John, we won't get everything right. We'll mess up and step on some things, have to come back, mid-course correct, and go back out again. But the point is, at the end of the day, we're very focused on what the goal is, which is nobody should be losing their home and their life savings for some foolishness that happened with an HOA, right? We have to build a bigger movement around this. Let me get to you, April. Let me pull you into this conversation too, because you really kicked this part of the conversation off, you know, talking about that, you know, the psychology, right? And I love that when you started out, you showed your house, right? What it was in the 30s and where it is today, just the psychology and go from here to there. It's like, wait, what, right? I love that, but say a little more about it.
You know, I think it's this, what you're mentioning, heart and mind dance that you invoke people or you invite them into. And again, I think the more of us that do that, I think of Ella Baker, I think of the living room and the study, you know, the study circles in people's living rooms, and resuscitating those tactics to have conversations. And it's similar to what Tanika's doing with the Folded Map project of bringing people together. I think because, again, the lift is Herculean to really begin to change this consciousness. And it's really embedded. I sit across from people who are incredibly progressive or identify themselves as progressive, but the solutions are very antiquated and archaic that reinforce that your heart is still not there, and empathizing what it means to lose a home, or what does it actually mean for a child to get up every single day in the conditions that I highlighted, and many are still doing that. Again, in our country, and how can we purport these value systems? And I keep going back to democracy, because I find in more of these very, you know, conservative groups, or groups that say, look, I pulled myself up by the bootstraps, my family came with $10 in their pocket. You have to say, well, no, you know, you forget, you know, you can't say you're against socialism. Meanwhile, you were a benefactor of the greatest social program in this nation's history, the New Deal. So when you begin to start breaking down what has been so intentionally omitted in our educational systems on the street, and finding ways to come out of your comfort zone, I really think we begin to go back to that cognitive shift that then begins to marry the heart and the mind. You know, it could be something as simple as, you know, for us, a developer came and said, well, what is, you know, how do you actually spatialize racial equity? You know, what does that even mean for public housing infill project? And it was working internally with their team, going through this history of Weeksville, Brooklyn. That was one of the biggest, you know, Black and Brown owned sections of New York City. And it's really taking people through this understanding that what we see today is not always what it's been. And it's, again, these intentional manipulations of the built environment that really produce our cognitive reinforcement. So it's not only, again, these conversations, but it's, I think, in the projects that we're all doing, you know, my lens is the spatial factor. I want people, when they walk down the street, to have a cognitive hit to say, this doesn't make sense because I wasn't taught this. So when you see housing that doesn't use labels, or you see housing in areas that have green space, or all of these aspects, it's forcing people to rethink these spatial barriers or the spatial footprint of omission and what we have done in our geographical footprint. And that is what, I think that is so essential, that people can see the low-hanging fruit when they are walking, when they get up every day. So the woman who lost her home that you mentioned, John or Tiffany, in the work, what is it that we do as part of the movement building and crowdfunding to reinstitute that? Because that story gains the hope back that it isn't just that these things happen, but that our hearts were tug enough that just because we weren't in Denver doesn't mean that we all can't participate in something to address what an egregious injustice is that, again, has been around since the first boats landed on this continent, with indigenous people being forced from their land. So I really think that how we approach this work and how we look at the tools that, again, just move beyond the rhetorical aspect, which is important, the day-to-days, the sitting downs, the education, but it's then what comes in splinters out of that. And for the work that we're doing in my space, it really is challenging when you think about 2% of architects are Black in this country. And not that color, the social construct of color, it's a cultural value that because of a history of losing a home or how homes have been built to have poor materiality or aesthetic in certain neighborhoods, it's saying, how much more beneficial would it be for a profession when you have representation of people that come from these backgrounds that have scaled already the barrier, the education and licensure, to come and sit at a table, and that together we all can do this work differently. Because unfortunately, and you've heard my gripe about this, Tiffany, is that even in the nonprofit space, we still are reproducing in mass numbers the same model that doesn't take into consideration our humanity and sort of the desegregation of these barriers and red lines that have, again, built our ideology and our concept around, again, human value within the built environment. So there's different ways. And for me, I really think the more we move forward and take the risks to show how we take the rhetoric into action, meaning how does it get visualized? How does public space look? Who interacts in that public space? All of that becomes incredibly important in shifting the spatial narrative and then addressing redress on a multiplicity of levels. The fact that you even that you're even doing green space before it becomes gentrified because of the historic disinvestment goes a long way in speaking that the intentionality is there, not because there's a profit or a movement coming in to erase this neighborhood, but because we've done wrong to our democracy for too long, and we're going to stand up for it.
Love it. Amen. Thank you very much. And all of that, to everything you just said. Give a high five. I'm like, yeah, what she said.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
And if I can get, there's lots of our people are in the chat saying, drop the mic. She did it. Yeah, we good. But there's a part of that I want to come back to that really connects to Tanika's work. So Tanika, I may want you to talk about this in a second. But just the sort of visualizing the sort of the spatial narrative and how we think about the visual of it, having people really reconcile what's in front of them and what they see with what has happened. And that is so, I think that is so important, because the sort of narrative that people are allowed to believe, that, as you were talking about, just we call it dominant narratives, like the dominant narratives that people get what, right, they work hard for, like without having to reconcile what happened. And I would say, Tanika, there's been part of your work visually, and I think my team has got it, some of your photos pulled up. I would love to have those pulled up just for a second to just visualize just some of the stunning work, particularly around the markers that you put in place in parts of the community to say, wait a minute, as you're going past this, right, this is a place where,
yeah,
right, some active violence went down, right? Like, don't roll down the street and believe that the people in this house or what condition of this house is a function of people not caring about where they live, that what you see in front of you is because this house was stolen, right? And having people visually have to like take a minute and grapple with that, I love it. Right?
Thank you.
So speak to that.
Yeah, no, to the point of what April and John were talking about, marrying the heart and the mind. This is why I think it's really important, and I think it's happening a lot more now, where artists are involved in these movements beyond just being a documenter or creating a sign or paintings or murals, like being included in these conversations and movements as a creative thinker, as a strategist, is really important, because this project, Inequity for Sale, which I'll share my screen in a minute to just give a little bit more detail about how that project came to be, is really about marrying the heart and the mind, and thinking of creative ways to get information to the larger public. And in my particular case, it was really important for this information that really began the downward spiral of my home neighborhood, is to base that in my home neighborhood of Greater Englewood. So I think this clip will speak more to that point. And this is a little media coverage about my Inequity for Sale project, and how it was rooted and born out of the research. And me being an artist, a creative thinker, who is really passionate about these large systemic issues, I saw a different way to connect this to the larger public. And I want to share that as inspiration or an example of all of the ways in which we can organize and use art to do so. I'm gonna share my screen.
And Tanika, while you're queuing that up, I want to say to people on the call that after this, we're gonna open it up to Q&A. So for those of you who've been waiting patiently with questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or the Q&A, and my team is curating those questions, because I know many of you have some direct questions you want to ask our panelists. So get ready, we're coming at you. All right, Tanika, take it away.
Yes, and also, Dr. T, if you could let me know if you hear this okay.
In the 1950s,
Yeah, we got it.
fake mortgages gave the holder all the responsibilities of a homeowner, but only the power of a renter. The predatory process stole more than 3,300 homes and counting from Black Chicagoans. This is the focus of activist and artist Tanika Johnson's pop-up installation, Inequity for Sale, the latest in her game-changing and thought-provoking creative projects. I met up with her to find out why she picked this as a moment in history that she wanted to highlight.
So being from Greater Englewood, growing up here and being a lifelong resident of it is really the motivation and inspiration for majority of my work. When you grow up in a neighborhood that has been historically disinvested in, and you see how it impacts your personal life, it becomes the point of reference for a lot of my work. I had to travel outside of my neighborhood to obtain access to a lot of the artistic programs I was interested in. I went to high school on the north side because of the lower quality schools that were in the neighborhood as a result of disinvestment. So this issue has pretty much colored not only my life, but everybody who is from this neighborhood.
But now you got this new project called Inequity for Sale, partnering with the National Museum of Public Housing. How did that all get rolling?
This report called The Plunder of Black Wealth came out, and it put a dollar amount on the money stolen from aspiring Black homeowners whose homes were sold to them on land sale contracts in the 50s and 60s. Greater Englewood has gained the reputation of being like the poster child of everything wrong in Chicago, but this is the beginning of how that came to be. And so that's when I knew I wanted to do something to breathe new life into this report, to help people understand this systemic issue in a more contemporary way.
So these land sale contracts, these scams we call them, it was predatory lending in a sense, right?
Yes, so it was a discriminatory housing practice that not only sold homes at an extremely high markup to Black families who were redlined into certain communities, but they actually didn't own the homes, and they thought they did. And so that's the insidious part of this discriminatory practice, is that one, it was just unfair, the actual markup of the homes, but also the lie they were lied to. They didn't have a mortgage and they were told that they did.
So your project identifies and shows what homes here in Inglewood were impacted by that.
So a lot of the homes that are in Inglewood now that are abandoned, a lot of the vacant lot, they were land sale contract properties. And so I view it as, you know, we're living amongst evidence of this crime, this hidden evidence, and we didn't know it. And when we wonder why our homes in this neighborhood have been devalued, have not appreciated in the way that other neighborhoods have, it's because of this history. So this project is identifying a collection of those land sale contract homes and putting land markers in front of them to acknowledge what happened here in this neighborhood and to memorialize the actual homeowners who were really pioneers.
This project itself, we're actually at the site of one of the homes, but it's not without controversy. The person who had ownership of this home wasn't very happy about the project.
Yes.
Took down the marker.
Yes.
What happened?
The most recent owner of this home took the land marker down within 2 weeks of it being installed. He said that people contacted him and asked if he was the one that stole the property from the people mentioned on the land marker. And he said he was offended by that. So he took the sign off and said that it was a lie.
Do you ask permission before you put these up?
No, because I specifically selected homes that were visibly neglected and abandoned. And personally, they are the perpetuation of the exact issue that my project aims to illuminate. Also, being a homeowner in this neighborhood and a resident, I literally have no respect for people who have property in my neighborhood that has been historically disinvested in, and they don't care for it, they don't keep it up, and it becomes an eyesore that decreases the value of the other homes that are on the block. So even though the land marker didn't seek to call out the current owners, the reason that I selected these homes is because they are the consequence of this discriminatory practice in the 50s and 60s.
So you were an artist who...
So that is my Inequity for Sale project. You can go to inequityforsale.org to find out more. And I do want to clarify, there are close to 600 homes documented in Greater Inglewood that were sold to aspiring Black homeowners on land sale contracts. And that's just the documented. It wasn't even a requirement to document that. So that says a lot. And then also the homes that are part of my project, when I say the current owner, these are owners who are not living in the homes. These are not owner occupied homes. These are second properties for these owners. So they don't live in those homes. They oftentimes don't even live in the neighborhood or even in the city. They own decaying properties in these neighborhoods. So I just wanted to kind of make that clarifying point, because also I wanted to use the project to help people understand that existing homeowners in Black neighborhoods, or Black homeowners in predominantly Black neighborhoods, they are the engine, and a lot of existing home ownership programs don't do enough to offer support to them to remain homeowners. A lot of attention is put on creating new homeowners, which is important, but this system has not shown, has not been proven to create generational wealth because of all of these discriminatory practices. So I really wanted to help people understand that there are existing Black homeowners in these disinvested neighborhoods. And if it were not for them, these neighborhoods would just be off the map, just completely. And a lot more needs to be done to help them remain homeowners, to get repairs that they have not been able to get because of all of these inequities in regards to insurance. Because the housing values are lower, their repairs cost more if they want to use their insurance to do so. So I just wanted to kind of stress those points and also, demonstrate how art and the use of the built environment can be incorporated into public education and connecting to people, because there has been many people in the neighborhood who didn't know this history. I didn't know this history before I knew it. And also people who come into the neighborhood, they use it as an invitation to learn about the actual neighborhood. So that's Inequity for Sale, if you all are interested to learn more.
Love it. So let me ask them. So I'm going to start I'm peeling off some of the questions from the audience that they have. Folks have, we don't have a lot of time, but I want to make sure we get some of these questions in here. Folks have questions about, and this may connect to something you were talking about, April, and certainly something we think about, John, at the Redress Movement, but examples, we have lots of examples of what's not working well, what is not the right way to do it. But folks are asking about, so where are we seeing at least the opportunities for doing the right thing? Like, what does the right thing look like? And you don't have to, I mean, we can say that we're still visioning on what that looks like, but where are the kind of places we can see, like what does it look like when we redress? What does it look like when things are moving in the right direction? It certainly doesn't look like when the house that you shared in that video is not the right way to go. So what does that look like when we do redress? And I have a lot to say about that, but I think I'll let y'all kick it off. April, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I'm going to again share my screen. This is a site that's located 10 minutes from the Lower 9th Ward in New Orleans. It's a site that a private landowner developer, not even a developer, an entrepreneur within the New Orleanian area said, I've acquired this site. He's a funeral director owner, and he said, I want to address the isms, particularly with the clientele that I'm burying. They're getting younger and younger because of the conditions in our community. So for us, what we did was not only look at the site, but the bigger ecology, to reference again the points that have been highlighted in this discussion around what speculation and land value and gentrification, et cetera. So a lot of these projects, while they begin on a site, they really invoke a process of understanding. Most people don't even know that this was even a former plantation site. People didn't know that a lot of the issues of climate that are affecting with flooding, et cetera, have to do with when the city of New Orleans is built. They take a lot of the cypress and extract it from this area, which creates the issues, the resiliency issues of today. So when we say what's working, it's the ability to go on a slow track with clients such as these to re-envision the space. So what we did in this particular project, the fact again that the design even invokes this type of a visioning in an area that probably other architects would say, no, we're not going to do that, really is sort of the first step of things that are working. So once we learn again, what is then the actionable opportunities? From the alleys, a lot of the trees that you're seeing here, because this was a former plantation site, invoke sort of the ancestral spirit of using particular trees to mark graves. So a lot of that is in this area. We created amphitheater. Again, this is a private site that now has been used as a public space within community. A lot of the buildings are integrating a lot of the activities. And it's not just the site, as I said, we're looking at how do you decouple renovation, restoration money for homeowners within this area, to Tanika's point, that have been historically disinvested in, so that they too can build equity and value within their homes and not be forced to be displaced from a community because projects come in and people start buying up the land just so that they can speculate on them. Again, this is very pivotal because the act of equity starts with even envisioning something different. This is all lifted on the site, whereas most traditional design would just build and the flooding would come and devastate yet another Black-owned business. The whole area is lifted. We've employed materiality like rammed earth that tells the story. So it's using what the fill, mixing it and becoming environmentally sound with the materiality. on the site, you see these parking lots. Those become later opportunities for housing, but it's invoking the entire neighborhood to understand, again, this visualization and aspect of projects, and using entrepreneurial and development spaces, not from this aspect of, oh, we're doing this for the poor little community and we're going to have all these sets of rules. It's someone who owns this and is saying, how do we build the stature of a visual representation of what can happen again in the community? In places like Trenton, it's addressing these, again, if you see this area that says Goose Town, urban renewal completely erased this historically Black community. Again, coming in and looking at what are the policies that decouple construction or renovation financial instruments from traditional mortgage appraisal instruments, because we are still devaluing these communities. And how do we look at the ecology and ecosystems so that we create productive landscapes? And we then begin to start visualizing how people come into these types of projects. So while we may address certain things within what we're doing with our work, it really creates the space for other stakeholders to build upon this momentum. The goal is how do you then carve that out, which typically is not part of these types of planning and design processes. So this is, again, the work that going back to this aspect of doing exhibitions and bringing people in. This is an exhibition we had in the summer in the High Line in New York City that's moving across many of their sister cities, talking about infrastructure and really allowing the greater public an understanding of how do you dissect this. So all of this, the 3P aspect of this work really begins to look at how we splinter out, as I was saying, back and forth. There was a question around how do you bring in this concept of affordable housing into communities that traditionally have the NIMBYism attitude. For me, it's design, design, design. When you look and you do, and that couples with the engagement pieces, the organizing, when people can see a visual, because unfortunately, when you say affordable housing, it's a bullseye that automatically conjures images of poverty, unfortunately, in our society. So when you create spaces that allow different neighbors to come in across the line and say, wow, this doesn't look what I thought it was going to be, we begin to deconstruct these social constructs of race that aren't even real in our society, and begin to get people to understand, again, the spatial dynamic of difference and how we begin to devoid these barriers. All of this work requires not only tremendous commitment, but people who want to, again, fund and take the risk of doing this. And here is a developer who, a funeral owner who's not a developer saying, I know I have an agency to do something very different in creating a productive landscape. So again, we can have these gestures to monuments and to organizing. This is the 2020 March on Washington from 1963, talking about and wanting the same issues. But then again, how are you going to activate these principles and concepts of democracy?
Love it. Love it. And I'm going to give the last word to you, John, in terms of thinking about some of the general campaigns we're thinking about and working on, and let's just give just a couple minutes.
So like loving what April said, but I think redress looks different in every community, and it will come down to what that community talks about. And so redress isn't always on the shoulders of Black folks to suggest what redress looks like. So I'll say in one of our cities, we have a group of white people who want to create a redress fund for the community, and people give to that. So that's one of the things. I think community land trust is what redress could look like. I think community benefits agreements is what redress would look like. I think the correcting of legislation that does away with rogue HOAs, even if they're operating legally, ethically, they're doing something inhumane to people and taking away from their housing. If you look at much of our website and many of the things we're talking about, that's what redress looks like. And a lot of it actually comes from the ground in organizing people. But I don't think there's one special thing that can redress decades, generations of disenfranchisement caused by systemic pressures. So at the end of the day, and April used this word at the end of it, I have a good friend of mine, William Freeman, and he really taught me the meaning of the word agency. And I think when we talk about agency and redress, you're talking about restoring agency to a people that it was taken away from. So if you take away housing, you take away my agency. You take away my opportunity to actually build in this country the number of things that we need to move forward. And that goes back and spans generations. So redress can be imagined by the community. And it kind of goes back to including the qualitative and the quantitative, the head and the heart, for us to reach the conclusion of where we need to get to. So don't be scared to imagine. That's what we have to tell people. Don't be scared to imagine, because many of us think within the walls of the system that has caused the oppression. But we have to think outside of those borders. We have to move past those borders through things like storytelling, sharing stories, the data, everything we've talked about on this call today. And I want to thank Tanika, because Tanika opened me up to artists when I met with her in Milwaukee, really being a part of the movement. And I met a wonderful artist in Milwaukee not too long after that, Fatima Laster, through Dynasty Caesar, who ended up putting forward something about corporate landlords. So Tanika helped me to imagine larger what organizing could look like by bringing in artists into space, and not just as somebody that's creative to put up a visual, but even deeper than that. And so I think this panel has done an entire job of describing many of the things that we could do. But I challenge everyone who is in the audience who asked that question, think to yourself and ask yourself also what redress looks like, and what can you do as an individual to help contribute and suggest what redress looks like in your community.
Love it. Love it. That's a great way to take us out. And we're a little bit at the very end. So I want to make sure that folks continue this conversation. You all can continue. Go to certainly the redressmovement.org, where you can sign up for the Say Yes to Redress, and start to do, even if, you know, some folks, they listen to us talk, they think they have to start off with the big stuff. Like, you know, April's an architect, Tanika's an artist, been doing this for a long time, John's been organizing for a long time, and they think they got to start out with some big project. You don't, right? You can start off at the most basic level, get a book club together, read Color of Law, start talking about it. Go to the websites, right? That Inequity for Sale, for redress. I forget project. Say it again, April. What's the name of your project? Project Democracy. Say it again real fast.
Oh, the practice of democracy.
The practice of democracy. But start to educate yourself and people around you about this issue. And then, as John said, help us at the Redress Movement and other people in your community reimagine what that can be. It can take any form you can imagine. And that's a part of what we wanted to share today, that folks from a whole range of occupations and just, communities can do this. Well, I would say also, reach out to us at the Redress for support. Like, that's part of what we want to do as we're building this movement, is to support folks all across the country like you, who are saying, I want to say yes, and I want to network with other folks who are thinking the same thing. But most of all, right, don't leave this website and be silent. Don't leave this website and stand still. Move your feet. Let's get to work, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. Redress Movement in the house. Thank you to the panelists for giving us a good part of the day today. We so enjoyed y'all. We're going to come back at y'all again next month with another webinar with our research folks. So stay tuned for that. All right. Thanks, everybody. Adios.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.
Thanks.